How do you make players feel things?
The shooting bit was fun, but it didn't engage me as a story.
That ability to affect the audience emotionally and take them somewhere, that I think is crucial for games.
Games do it so well. Once upon a time, there was a story. Not stories as in books and movies, stories as in video games. Stories are everyone's business. Players, narrative designers, developers, studios, and of course, the characters. Whether we're talking Link, Ellie, or Geralt, stories can span moments or entire lives. It's time to tell a story about stories. Video games may be the gawky new kid on the block in comparison to literature or even cinema, but they still tell the lives of characters and places in millions of different ways. Millions? Okay, I haven't counted, but there must be a lot of them. Video games have told stories via a student workbook, through audio sources, via a secret diary, through exploitative relationships, and with objects. There are several narrative prototypes used throughout storytelling and video games. Low narrative content. These are games with one clear performance-related objective. This category covers fight games, sports games, race games, and of course, platformers. The total story game. The story is prominent and engaging, my favorite type. The gameplay involves working through a well-constructed narrative coherent with the graphics and atmosphere. There are two variants, linear and non-linear. Some of them are more tightly woven than others, like Doom, Diablo, or the Legend of Zelda franchise. Sometimes the players progress the game, where the narrative depends on the player progression rather than a master plot. Players are free to act or interact at will throughout the course of the game. GTA falls within this category. And video games are at the forefront of pushing narrative boundaries and stretching boundaries between fantasy and reality, all via player involvement. Check out the Stanley Parable, Undertale, and Control. It's all about emotions. Like Journey, a truly cathartic experience, or Abzu. Naughty Dog games in particular are really good at squeezing out emotions rarely seen in video games using captivating stories and strong characters. Anyone who's played The Last of Us knows what I mean. But narrative doesn't just have to be tear-jerking. It can also be terrifying, especially when players' choices can influence how a character may wind up. In Until Dawn, you're playing 8 characters, and the game can end with none or all of them surviving a night of horror. But the big hero of game narrative has to be the player. After all, the video games enable the players to take responsibility for the stories and the characters, even when the consequences aren't clear. Quantic Dream games like Heavy Rain, for example, use forking paths and QTE, which gets the player thinking they are in control of the story. But maybe the real brains behind the story is actually the narrative designer. Narrative designers work out how the game is going to pan out and wind up in victory. They come up with the dialogue, but also the characters that the player will meet throughout the game. They create the universe where the players are going to spend hours, days, even weeks of their lives. So they're like God? So let's meet a couple of gods now then. Hey, welcome to Talk, and this episode I'm talking about narration in video games with my two amazing guests. First of all, we have Rhianna Pratchett, who is an award-winning writer on many games, including The Rise of the Tomb Raider and my personal favorite, Mirror's Edge, and also Adam Williams from Quantic Dream, who was the lead writer on the brilliant Detroit Become Human. Hey guys, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thank you for being with me. My first question to you both would be, do you personally like story-intense games? Is that something you actually like? I know you write for them, but do you like playing them?
I probably play them less than I did before I did this job, I think, because sometimes you just go into work mode and you're sort of over-analysing the story, and it can be difficult to sort of slip back into that, just being a player mode. So I tend towards games that have an emerging narrative. I really like wilderness survival games. That's very much my niche. So things like The Long Dark, Don't Starve, and The Long Dark has a really good story mode that I enjoy a lot. So I sort of go in and out.
Okay. So you see the long, intensive ones more as work as opposed to for yourself to decompress.
Sometimes I have to be in the right mood. But yeah, the ones I go to over and over again probably are a little bit more story light.
Okay. And you, Adam?
I mean, I do play narrative. You said narrative intense games, right?
Yeah.
I think there are lots of different ways games can do narratives. So I understand what you mean about you slip into work mode, because games where the player's decisions are affecting what's supposed to happen in the plot I find myself doing the same thing when I'm playing them and thinking, God, how are they going to manage this decision? Or is this choice really going to matter? And so on. I've been replaying Braid, which I still think about sometimes.
I've never heard of that game.
It was like it's Jonathan Blow was an indie platformer.
Okay.
But there's a time control device in it.
Right.
And you can play scenes backwards and forwards.
Oh.
And there's a key moment in one of the scenes where you play the same events backwards and your perception of the events has changed completely. So it's not interactive narrative in the sense of you're not changing the story, but the way you interact with the game changes your feeling about the narrative very much. And that kind of thing I really enjoy.
Why don't I know about this game? Like, damn it, that is right up my street.
He's done another one more recently, which is like a puzzle. You're on an island and you have to solve puzzles.
So obviously you're in the industry, in the world. What are the narrative games or the narrative intense games that have impressed you?
I'm just starting Psychonauts 2. And I was a huge fan of Psychonauts, and I'll probably talk about that at some point later. But I really liked Unavowed by Wadget Eye Games. That was a sort of more traditional point and click style game with a sort of like urban supernatural noir vibe.
Okay. How about you, Adam? Any ones that
This morning I was playing 12 Hours.
Okay. Yeah, I've got that on my Steam wishlist, I think it is, but I don't have it.
So I won't spoil it, but you play the same short period of time over and over again.
It's top down, isn't it?
It is top down, which is an unusual decision for a game like that.
Yeah.
I guess what it does and what that game does generally, which is quite nice, is it keeps inviting you to step outside the events. The perspective helps with that.
Yeah.
So you step outside the events and consider, based on what I know, how could I influence things differently? And that really is an interactive narrative in the sense that the core gameplay is trying to influence what happens in the story through the choices you make.
So I've never thought about it that way, because the way that game is designed changes the way you think about the story. You think of it as an outsider as opposed to being in the story. So when it comes to you, both of you working on stories for games, do you work and tell them, I want the story to be told from this perspective, or do you have to kind of go along with what the publishers want? How does that work?
I think the more interesting question is, how do you compromise with the player's vision of the story?
Right.
Because you as a writer come in and you might have your conception of what the story means, or which character is the main character, or whether they're a good person or not. But in a good interactive story, you can accommodate the player seeing things differently. And the 12 Hours example is a good one that you give, because on the one hand you feel outside the game, but on the other hand the immersion comes from the fact that what happens on screen is to some extent your fault.
Yeah, you're causing it. Yeah, exactly.
And as writers, we're always looking to get you to feel like what's happening, the stakes are yours somehow. You have an interest in the outcome. And if you put a character in a difficult situation, your investment of getting them out again is quite intense. Especially if you're the one who has to figure out how to do it.
When it comes to stories, ones that you've both written or experienced, which has been the most unforgettable for you both?
This is where I can bring up Psychonauts.
There we go.
Psychonauts is probably one of my top favourite games, and I love the way it uses level design as storytelling. So because you're literally going into people's minds, they can use the environment to tell you something about the character and the demons they're facing, and you're literally fighting their fears, and even down to the collecting mechanics. It's all thematically built in. So there's the sorting out emotional baggage, where you have to find a handbag and the right tag, and then the handbag gets all happy when you give it the tag and does a little dance and things, and you have a little hoover to hoover up like mental cobwebs and things like that. And I think it really impressed me. It's such a great level of storytelling and humour and just charm. But yeah, it was using the level and the environment and the art as storytelling that I think I haven't seen done as well in a game before, although I think BioShock did it very well. Yeah. BioShock definitely stayed with me, particularly the first one, although I do think the second one is very good as well and is better for combat than the first one was. Like, I really enjoyed the big sisters in the second one.
Adam, what about the game that most impacted you when it comes to story? Like, kind of something that brought you into this journey of your career, essentially.
I can remember being young and there was the console transition to the PlayStation 1.
Oh, yeah.
So I'd been playing Sega Mega Drive games.
Okay, no Nintendo?
I realise you're Club Nintendo.
Yeah, if you didn't give it away now.
All the cool kids played Mega Drive, though.
Okay,
Just saying.
sure.
So when the PlayStation 1 comes out, and I played Metal Gear Solid, and the game felt like it was the first time that you could put games alongside movies, TV shows, novels.
Yeah.
Games had always been in this separate category of entertainment, I think.
Yep.
And once you had that kind of cinematic storytelling, it wasn't an interactive story.
Yeah.
But it was the realization that you could get narrative satisfaction and go on a real adventure playing a game. And then professionally, working on the Kara thread in Detroit Become Human was...
That was a good thread. I like that.
Usually in games, I think, even if you face impossible odds, you're uniquely equipped to deal with them. You're the chosen one. You're the one that's going to save the day. And Kara was an outsider.
Yeah, completely.
It was what happens if you play the disempowered person who's looking up at this unjust society from underneath and has an impossible task against you. It's one of those areas, I think, where you reach a kind of frontier in what games normally do.
Yeah.
And you realise there's this whole area that hasn't been explored yet in the medium, I think.
100%. Where do you both get your inspiration from when it comes to writing stories? Because with Detroit Become Human, like I kind of likened it to the American Civil War with like at the back of the bus kind of thing, and I could recognise some of the themes in there. So where do you guys get your inspiration for stories?
Oh, there's a man around the back of Sainsbury's in Angel that's got bags of it.
Just listening to him all the time.
As writers, I think you've got to be a sponge for stories, for knowledge, for information, for just being interested in the world and interested in people. So you need to read, and I don't think enough emphasis is put on that. But reading around maybe the particular genre you're writing for, history, science, philosophy, theatre, pay attention to the news, listen to people's stories. You've got, to produce content out, you've got to have a lot of good content in.
Yeah.
And so I don't think there's any sort of one place.
Would you agree, Adam? Is it the same thing for you? Or is it your process different?
As a storyteller, because I had a background in television before this, in that kind of format, you're trying to figure out what story you want to tell and the best way to tell it. The minute you're looking at interactive storytelling, where the player is supposed to influence the outcome, you're actually looking for an interesting question rather than an interesting story, I think. Yeah, and what that means is the player's invited to make their contribution, and their contribution's clear, and everybody can have an interesting perspective on that question. So you mentioned some of the civil rights themes in Detroit and so on. If you find a question which is very germane to society and which means a lot to a lot of people, and you pose it very, very honestly,
they can relate in some way.
And they can make, in the process of navigating the story, they're invited to think about the issues.
Right.
We talked about Carr earlier, or indeed Marcus. I'm writing for Marcus, and David and I are talking about Marcus's story. And as the writer, you're supposed to seriously invite yourself to see the world from that standpoint.
From that perspective.
Yeah. And so that inspiration really for us is a very, very good question.
I like the way of thinking about it as well, because you give the player the different tools to answer in different ways. Like I love Detroit Become Human. I've played it 3 times.
Which ending did you get? Do you remember?
So I chose the rebellion at first.
Violent rebellion.
Yeah. Moving on, Christian. You don't want to spark no rebellion here, but yeah, I chose that one at first. And I loved the scene with the boat specifically, because that just brought everything to life to me. It brought all the kind of moments where all your choices have been out. Now you're living out the consequences of these choices of who's going to survive and who's going to stay. And I think
that's a good thing to point out, because it's one thing in an interactive story to find these interesting questions. And you do sometimes encounter games which bombard you with decisions.
Yeah.
And it's not really clear what's changed as a result of those decisions. And audiences are very cute about that. They know when that's happening. They see it coming a long way.
Choice is an illusion.
If you can give choices serious consequences, that's when people really sort of think about them. And so scenes like that, where everything's supposed to come together and it's supposed to be a culmination of the decisions you've made, they're the kind of punchline to the story, I think, when it's interactive.
Gameplay is often where I start looking add a character, because one of the interesting things about games is, and this is you work in house, so it might be a bit different, but narrative is handled by one department and gameplay is handled by another department. And when you're writing a movie or a TV script, we say action equals character. So what a character does tells you more about who they are really than maybe what they say. But in games, action is handled by another department that may have their own objectives that have nothing to do with narrative. So this huge storytelling mechanic is not controlled by the writers, unless you've got a writer in charge like David, like Ken Levine, Neil Druckmann, Amy Hennig, that really have kind of hard power to say this is the way that it's going to be, and have a vision for it. But for me, I try and look at what the gameplay is and think about what the character that would do that sort of thing comes out of. So you're talking about Mirror's Edge. I think, okay, Faith runs a lot, but when I came on to Mirror's Edge, it had all been designed with no narrative in mind, and no one had really answered the why questions, like why the city looks like this, why Faith
is rebellious.
Yeah, why she parkours over the rooftops and things like that. So I had to sort of wrap a story around what was there. And I thought, okay, she's running. What is she really running from? What is going to make her stop and face what she's running from, what she's frightened of? And so often, looking at the gameplay mechanics can be very helpful for inspiring aspects of the character and aspects of the story as well.
I really love Mirror's Edge. It's one of I said this to you before, but I really love Mirror's Edge. It's one of my first games that I felt. One, obviously, the protagonist was a woman of color, which was really important for me to see on screen. And the second was that she's rebellious. See, there's a thread here that's forming. I don't want to give people the wrong idea. But so let's talk about, do you think the video game industry needs narrative talents to bring the games to life and boost sales? Like, is narrative... You're probably going to be biased, but is narrative that important?
We're completely non-essential.
Yeah.
It depends what kind of experience you're making, of course. But as we touched on earlier, there's lots of ways to think about narrative.
Right.
We were talking about Dungeon Keeper. Dungeon Keeper is a game with no story, really. But the narrative context is quite rich. And people still talk about the characters that you can encounter in the game, how it felt, the soundtrack, the general storytelling environment, and you go to a place when you play a game like that. That ability to affect the audience emotionally and take them somewhere, that I think is crucial for games. But there's as many ways to do it as there are games. I mean, that's the interesting thing about games, I think, is it's such a young medium relative to some of the others.
Yeah.
And TV and cinema have somewhat coalesced or consolidated around certain ways of doing things.
Right.
And with games, everything is still to be discovered.
Well, that's why some of them are looking at games, right? They're looking at, they're or making series or making movies out of games, because I do feel like TV and traditional media and cinema, they're becoming a bit repetitive, to say the least. Remakes and reboots all the time. But when you go to games, because it, again, comes from people's imaginations as well, there's so much to explore that I don't think gets explored enough in games, let alone in traditional TV media.
Well, I think interactivity is, when you're looking at the history of when the history of storytelling is written, once interactive media showed up, that's clearly a landmark event. And I don't think it's really been absorbed yet.
I don't think so.
You're beginning to see TV shows try to incorporate interactivity. You're beginning to see what they are sometimes calling second experience cinema. So you see the movie, which then makes you play the game, and you live in a franchise universe rather than just consuming one piece of entertainment. Interactivity is such a big shift, and it does all the things we really want to do as storytellers. It gets the audience immersed. They feel engaged in what happens.
Yeah.
They feel responsible for the way things turn out on screen. And they feel that the story is somehow theirs because it is, because they've collaborated in the telling of that particular version.
And that's why I don't think that TV and media should actually adopt it. I think it should stay with games, because games do it so well. I think so I remember Bandersnatch with Netflix, and the whole kind of forking paths and stuff, and it was good, but I was like, it doesn't do what it meant to do for me personally. I really enjoy playing games because it's so well crafted, whereas Bandersnatch for me just didn't hit the way that I think they wanted gamers to feel about it, because they really were looking at gamers to kind of feel a certain way about that.
Yeah, and I think the tough thing is the audience that's going to play your interactive TV show will have played video games.
Exactly.
So they're coming to it with this context of interactive stories can be like this. How are you going to compete on that basis? But on the other hand, it would be odd, I guess, if games completely owned interactivity and they just let us keep it, because it's such a weapon in storytelling. I don't know if you find that as well.
Well, theatre's been using interactivity a lot more,
right.
And that seems to be having a great success. With interactive theatrical experiences where you sort of walk around
immersive
the
theatre.
actors. And I think they're kind of having probably more success that I think has been with other mediums adopting interactivity. I think with Bandersnatch, I personally felt like, okay, but games have been doing this for years.
I didn't want to say it, but just
it was sort of, everyone was very excited about it, and I said, like, it's been done.
Been there, done there.
But I do think it's very interesting, and I actually think there's quite a lot that game writers can learn from theatre, and I think that's been one of the most successful uses of interactive narrative.
Do you think new technologies like virtual reality, VR, are going to enhance the video game storytelling experience?
I played Arizona Sunshine, which is a sort of zombie shooter survival game, but I think
I played that.
Yeah, I was really surprised how little story there is in it. And it was fun. I played it with my partner. We both have headsets where sort of in different areas of the kitchen, like walking into the fridge and things like that. And it was fun as a cooperative experience, and the shooting bit was fun, but it didn't engage me as a story, and it had very, very little sort of story, no story moments really, no other characters, and it is fun, but it is like going to arcade in the 90s.
Talking about story in VR, I think the big challenge there is the camera.
Exactly.
And we worry a lot about Quantic about interactivity versus curation. So in a movie, we show you exactly what to look at. In a game, you tend to have some freedom about where to look, and then for certain important story moments, you won't, because we're going to show you what you need to look at. In VR, the player's gaze is completely free.
Uncontrolled,
And until they solve that problem, it's hard to see how you're going to do important story in VR, because somebody could just be looking in the wrong direction.
The objective. Okay, see you later. Goodbye.
Or someone's giving you a very emotional dialogue, and you're looking the wrong way.
That's hilarious to me.
And it's a big problem, because you, as a writer, there are moments when you want to try and grab the audience's attention and say, pay attention to this aspect of the story, and you can't really do that.
And how do you do that? How do you make players feel things? How do you what's the word? How do you, you get to that moment.
to engage emotionally.
Yeah, but also, when you get to that moment of a game and you don't know what to do, and so you go online to go Google the answer, how do you craft the game or the story to make players do that? Do you do it intentionally?
We try to, the way we get you to really worry about a particular situation the character's in, you're trying to make the player identify with the character as much as possible.
Right.
And as we discussed before, if you put the character in trouble because of some decision you made, you feel particularly responsible to get them out. That, like looking online for how to get out of a particular problem, that works best, I think, with games where there's a good solution and a kind of a wrong solution.
When it's binary.
And what we tried to do on Detroit was say, there's your answer, which you need to think about, but there's no guarantee that any option's going to turn out.
Yeah, because we're tricky with that. Got on my nerves.
We're very sneaky.
Got on my nerves.
Yep.
Look, it's a good answer. Next thing you know, no. I was like, oh, God damn it. How about you, Rhianna? How do you get people to emote and to really get invested into your stories?
I mean, sometimes it can come in unexpected ways that you can't plan for. What I do is what I have done is much more linear based. It's very character focused. So having a good character arc at play that players can engage in has always been helpful. But you'll just be surprised where players will find themselves. With the first Tomb Raider, we had so many comments from gamers who had felt sort of empowered by playing as Lara and seeing her like in a stressful situation, not knowing what to do, and just managing to sort of pull herself up by her bootstraps and realise that, no one's going to come to rescue her, she had to rescue herself. And that helped them get out of difficult situations in real life, like to the, on one end, get out of abusive relationship, on the other end, go to the gym. And it's sort of like those stories where you've affected someone in real life because of what you've done with a character in a game is just the best feeling. It's very difficult to design for. I think it's a very natural. It seems to be more of a natural thing, but I think focusing on characters and good character and characterization has sort of helped me. But there's some things you just can't predict.
It just sounds like not in a bad way, but it sounds like you play God. You get the player in the place where you want them to think that this answer is the right answer, or you get them to be really attached to this character, then you rip them away from them and just.
I think what you at least should try and do is give people an honest picture of the consequences of their choices. But of course, you also want them to feel something.
Right.
So if you can
looking at you, honest consequences.
If you can put someone in deep, deep trouble, that's probably going to make for a good story.
Interesting.
Honestly, because people, we were talking about people who write in.
Yeah.
We had a similar thing on Detroit where we had people in kind of domestic abuse type situations writing in and talking about Cara, or people who were experiencing discrimination, writing about Marcus. You do realise that we might call them games, but particularly narrative-based games, for some people,
it's real life.
Yeah, and it really hits them on, in ways that maybe even you as the writer can't honestly say you've experienced that. If you do the story really honestly and you try and do it really honestly, people tend to recognise that, I think. I think that's true about it being a natural thing, where if you go in saying we're going to make people cry with this scene, people do tend to sense that because they're quite cute to storytellers trying to manipulate them.
I've noticed that a couple of times. And when they get you really attached to a character that you've just met, I'm like, they're going to kill that person.
Yeah,
he's going to die in the next 5 minutes.
He's doomed. Yeah.
Literally, anime does that a lot as well. Okay, so one question that I have for you both is that you both have kind of taken steps away from traditional video game telling. What are the next developments you think that are coming in your field?
If you look at interactive storytelling in video games, the scale's getting bigger all the time. The games are getting longer, the amount of choices are increasing. People want to see dramatically different consequences for the actions that they take. So that is all to come, I think. What intrigues me in terms of the history of the industry is most genres now have somehow incorporated online. So you have an online shooter, or you have online RPG type games, or you have online strategy type games. It's quite tough to see how you're going to integrate online into a pure narrative-based game. If it's done, it would be very interesting, because if you're dealing with another character who's being played by another person, the magnitude of their decisions is going to be even greater. Yeah. Right? This character screwed me over, and there's a real person in there who made that decision.
Sorry.
But how that's done, I don't know.
Wars will start.
Yeah. It will upset global politics, but it'll make a lot of money. So.
It reminds me of, I don't know if you've ever heard of or played Guild Wars 2, but they have like this story system where like you go into a map and there is an event that triggers, it replays, but you do feel like it progresses your personal story for your personal character, even though it's an MMO. Yeah. So I think they've done the balance quite well. I'm really looking forward to seeing if they do any more games. But they did it quite well, where the story of the world is the story of the world, but you can still have an impact for your personal story, which is different for the next person.
Yeah, and I think Guild Wars is a great example, and MMORPGs in general are a good example. One possible solution to this online narrative problem is to say there's a global story, which is kind of curated and fixed, and then there's the personal arc of your character. And if you design those things intelligently enough, everybody could be on their own journey, but also part of this communal experience. That might be the way it's done.
Rhianna, what do you think are next for storytelling in games or character crafting?
I'd be very interested to see what's happened with episodic narrative. When I was back at PC Zone, someone came in to show me like an episodic game they had, and this must have been like 18 17, 18 years ago, and it was an Arabian Nights game, and now I feel like I dreamt it because nothing ever, I don't think it ever came out, and I was like, wow, this is very interesting, but I don't know how they're going to get it to players in episodic chunks. But I saw it, it was there. It was like VR was the first time we thought everything was going to be like Lawnmower Man, and then nothing happened for like 20 years. And it was there, I swear, it was around then. I don't even remember who it was. I just remember it was an Arabian Nights game and it was episodic. And then obviously, Telltale came along with The Walking Dead and The Wolf Among Us, which was probably my favourite of their games. And also Don't Nod have picked up the baton, but we haven't seen any more studios getting on that. And I think that's a very interesting format because you've got a tighter narrative experience. You can do something a bit more like TV writing with episodic games. 100%. And you've got a lot more space to develop the characters. And I think that's very interesting. As I've got older and advanced my writing career, I've just wanted to find something to say about something like us and our world, and that's become sort of more important. So I look for the experiences where I think there's a new tale to be told, there's a new perspective to be delved into, and that's become more important to me. And I think it's been amazing seeing what has been coming out of the indie game space in the last sort of 7 or 8 years. Some really impactful personal stories, like things like that Dragon Cancer. Is kind of one that's sort of stuck with me, and they games that really have something to say, that are using different perspectives, that are building up stories that we don't tend to see in maybe the AAA games, and I think that is very exciting.
All right, it's time to wrap up the show with a quiz. As with all good interactive games, there are several answers, and one will lead you down the path to rightness. Regardless, we're gonna go. Okay. Yep. What's the name of the old tree that tells Hyrule's story in the Ocarina of Time? A, the Great Ducko Tree, B, the Great Deco Tree, C, the Great Deku Tree, or D, the Great Bake-Off Tree?
That's quite a tough one.
So I don't know.
I'm going to go C.
I'm going to go A, just because I don't know.
So you're saying Great Ducko and you're saying Great Deku?
Deku, yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay, C is correct. Well done, 1 point. All right, next question. In The Sims, one player took the interactive aspect a bit too far and was fined for his misdemeanor. What did he do? A, he beat up Sims in exchange for money. So don't. B, he used the Sims to deal drugs in the real world. C, he created a brothel where players paid real money for virtual services. Or D, he'd customized other players' characters as Nazis. Oh, damn.
What was B again, please?
B was he used the Sims to deal drugs in the real world.
I think it was B. It better not be D, because
I'll go with C just because I'll just go with B.
So B and C.
Yeah.
C is correct. Well done. You created a brothel with...
I came back to it.
Next question. The Wolf Among Us mixes detective thriller with fable. The main character, Big B Wolf, gets transformed into a werewolf by night. What is his profession by day? A, sheriff, B, private detective, C, police commissioner, or D, no real profession, just an OnlyFans account?
I think, private investigator.
Private detective?
Yeah.
Private detective.
Yeah, he's PI.
B. The answer's A, he was a sheriff.
Oh, okay.
All right, next question. In the world of video game narration, what does QuickTime event mean? A fast cinematic. B, a moment when the player has to press specific buttons in a limited time. C, a swiftly executed act of coitus.
Coitus?
C.
It doesn't say coitus.
It does. D, a subliminal clue, so quick you might miss it.
B.
You still on coitus, are you?
Someone says you want a QuickTime. There's too many QuickTime events in games. We're somewhat known for our QTEs at Quantic.
Yeah.
And I think it's when you need to input a specific button combination. I mean, by the way, you could describe most game design as QTE.
Yeah.
I mean, you need to shoot in time, you need to jump in time, but I'm not bitter about that. That's fine.
But you're prompted in QTE.
It tells you what buttons to push usually in a QTE, yeah.
Okay, so you both know what it is. It's B, right? You gave me your answer.
Unless that's the answer I gave is the answer I think it is.
Yeah,
unless that's A or something.
B. All good.
I am the worst quizmaster ever. Okay, next question.
Right.
At its release, Heavy Rain received critical acclaim for its smart fusion of video games and cinema. Its creator, David Cage, and Adam's boss, I guess, was called A, the Spielberg of gameplay, B, the David Lynch of the 10th art, C, the Bergman of video games, or D, the Michael Bay of the small screen?
I mean,
I kind of really want to say
I would love to say he'd been called the Michael Bay.
All the explosions.
Yeah, but I think it was A.
Okay.
I would imagine A as well.
It's C, the Bergman of video games. Next question. Her Story is an interactive game in which players have to solve a murder mystery. Where is it set? A, an interrogation room, B, a courtroom, C, an American diner, or D, Nando's in Peckham?
A.
I guess interrogation is the right answer.
Yes, it is.
I would play a sequel set in Nando's, though.
Could you imagine?
I love a Nando's.
Cheeky Nando's. Next question. What is a walking sim in video games? A hiking simulation game, B, a game inspired by The Sims, C, a game based on more interaction than narrative, or D, a game based on narrative more than interaction?
I'm going to go D.
D?
Yeah, D.
Well done, it's D. A game based on narrative more than interaction. Next question. Mist-likes are video games that are set in a dream world, full of mystery and enigmas to be solved. Which of the following games isn't a Mist-like?
Okay.
A, Mist, B, Crisis, C, Celtica, or D, Revelation?
I think Crisis is a shooter.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
So
yeah,
I'm
so
gonna
B.
go-
Yeah.
The consensus amongst the writing council is B.
The council's correct. It's
Yeah.
definitely B.
Absolutely.
Okay, and final question. One video game pushes the narrative envelope by using controllers to emulate workers' movements. The repetitive action makes you realize the hardship of the humdrum worker's life. What is the game? A, Gone Home, B, Firewatch, C, What Remains of Edith Finch, or D, A Normal Lost Phone?
I've never heard of D, so I'm going to go with D.
You're going to go with D?
Yeah.
I think that's the safe bet.
It's What Remains of Edith Finch. So scores are in from Magic in the Air, and you both have 5 points. So well done.
Yay.
Well done, everyone.
Score draw.
Yeah, score draw. Thank you so much for joining me on today's talk. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. And now we're going to go to top 5. This might sound controversial. It's the interactive aspect of games that's the really important bit. Agree? Yes? Of course you do. And some games have worked this out and turned the narrative process into the star of the show. So here are the top 5 best interactive games. If you don't agree, go ahead and let off steam in the comments. Number 5, The Stanley Parable. There are interactive games and then there are interactive games that make fun of interactive games. In The Stanley Parable, you can make a lot of choices that will affect the ending of the story, but the game is so good at predicting your reactions, you clearly wonder if you're really that free. Isn't that cool? Number 4, Heavy Rain. In Heavy Rain, each decision we make affects the story in an irreversible way, and each choice to hand are really cool things like kill a dealer who's also a parent, chat to the police about a missing child, drink poison to save your son. It's harrowing stuff, and it makes me grateful I'm not actually there. Number 3, Child of Light. Child of Light is not only interactive, it also boosts an ultra-poetic narration. To give you an idea, the game features dialogues in verse. I repeat, dialogue in verse. How many narrators do you know who can do that? Yeah, didn't think so. Number 2, Detroit Become Human. Welcome to 2038, a world where androids share their daily lot with humans. The game that gives you the chance to test drive the future. Because let's be honest, this dystopia is probably where we're headed, right? Number 1, Life is Strange. In Life is Strange, you also get to take difficult decisions that influence the rest of the story, but you get a glimpse of the consequences of each action beforehand. It sounds like a dream, but actually it just means more responsibility, and no one needs that. I'm barely responsible for myself, let alone a bunch of fictional teenagers.